You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 23rd of September 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up.
Hezbollah has been choking Lebanon, destroying Lebanon. We are here simply to defend ourselves. That's all we do. We have to take action like any normal nation would do in order to defend its people.
As more than 30 die in an Israeli strike in Lebanon and heavy exchanges of fire are reported all weekend, we ask what remains for diplomacy. Also coming up.
Actually, this is not for one person. This is for every person. This is for freedom. He's thinking about the peoples.
Sri Lanka goes to the polls and an outsider wins 2 years after the economy collapsed. We'll have the latest on a battle to secure a stable future for the country. Plus, we'll go through Monday's papers, look at what the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi stands to gain from a trip to Washington, and we'll check in at Milan Fashion Week 2. That's all ahead on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in today's news. At least 4 people have been killed and 18 injured in a mass shooting in Birmingham, Alabama. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has arrived in the United States, urging his partners to help achieve a shared victory for a truly just peace. And Iran's elite revolutionary guards have ordered their members to stop using any type of communication devices after thousands of pagers and walkie-talkies used by its Hezbollah allies in Lebanon were blown up last week. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, the backdrop to this week's UN General Assembly in New York is a dangerous one, more dangerous perhaps than ever. Not only are we 2.5 years into a Russian invasion of its neighbour Ukraine and approaching the first anniversary of the Israel-Hamas conflict, there are fears now of an all-out war between Israel and Hezbollah in neighbouring Lebanon. This weekend saw an increase by both sides in cross-border attacks, leading to the United Nations issuing a warning that the region faces imminent catastrophe. Well, I'm joined now by Julie Norman, who's the co-director of University College London's Centre on US Politics, and by Sir Mark Lowcock, former head of humanitarian affairs at the United Nations and now a fellow of the Centre for Global Development. A very good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Julie, let us begin with what is currently happening. If you could just briefly recap a very, very violent weekend, which looks by all accounts to be continuing this morning, with the Israeli military saying it is conducting extensive strikes and ordering evacuation of citizens from their homes in parts of Lebanon.
Absolutely. So as listeners are probably aware, things escalated dramatically last week with the attacks on the Hezbollah pagers and walkie-talkies. That was followed by a direct strike against a senior Hezbollah official in Beirut on Friday, of which they are still trying to pull people out of the rubble. There have been dozens of people killed and many more wounded in that strike, followed by strikes across southern Lebanon on different types of Hezbollah infrastructure over the weekend by Israel. Also reported casualties, and then Hezbollah also launching rockets, about 150 into Israel, much deeper than they have in the past, not as deep as they have capabilities to, but reaching as deep towards Haifa and some of the other more central cities. I would point out this is happening still without a ceasefire in Gaza, so also strikes in Gaza over the weekend that also resulted in casualties. So real fast escalation in the region, both sides also using a lot of rhetoric suggesting they are not going to back down and that we can expect more of this, not less, I expect, in the week to come.
And Mark, this trading of threats, which is being increasingly matched by violence, has led to the UN warning that the Middle East is on the brink of an imminent catastrophe. What does that mean?
I think it is a signal of the really growing scale of alarm across the world on all the escalation we're seeing. You saw last week that the General Assembly of the UN, by a very large majority, passed a resolution backing a judgment from its highest court, the International Court of Justice, that Israel's continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territories is unlawful and that they should bring that presence to an end. There were 124 countries backing that, just 40 against, and a few dozen abstaining. But the problem is that unless the belligerents in a conflict want to do a deal and their backers force them to do a deal, resolutions and laws don't carry much sway. So, the issue is whether what everybody broadly agrees needs to happen can be forced upon the belligerents. And one problem is that some of the participants have basically decided ongoing war is in their best interest. That looks to be the case for Prime Minister Netanyahu. He thinks that the ongoing war is his best chart of staying in power. He faces corruption allegations, probably a court case if he loses power. And so I think what's in his mind is, how do I stay in power as long as possible in order to stay out of jail? And those kind of considerations are what's driving a lot of what we're seeing, unfortunately.
Mark, your line isn't being very friendly towards us, but we will persist with you. But in the meantime, I'll talk to Julie about what you've just said. The idea that ongoing war is in Benjamin Netanyahu's best interests, but neither side really do they want an all-out war against each other. Is that true or not?
Well, that is certainly what we've all heard for the last year, and that's certainly the conventional wisdom. And with that said, there is obviously truth to what Mark said and to Netanyahu's personal considerations and all of this. But I will point out, just having spent a lot of time in the region this summer, from an Israeli point of view, this escalation with Hezbollah has been coming for quite a while from many Israelis' point of view, not just Netanyahu. From their point of view, Hezbollah has been targeting northern communities since October 7th with over 8,000 rockets. People on both sides of the border have been displaced, so tens of thousands of people who have been evacuated from these communities. And many in Israel, again, not just Netanyahu, see this as a violation of Israeli sovereignty that they felt was unsustainable and were going to have to match. On the other side, again, Hezbollah has been a very capable actor that has been growing in strength since it was first created in the 1980s. And their goal has been, resistance against Israel, and I don't see that going away anytime either.
Mark, where is the advantage here? Is it Israel, despite the fact that it has both now Gaza to deal with and increasingly Hezbollah in Lebanon, or does Hezbollah, with the backing of Iran, have enough to withstand any kind of full conflict?
I think it's worth recapping the history a little bit here. I mean, Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982 and held parts of the country until 2000. And then there was a further incursion in 2006. But what happened as a result of all of these incursions is that Hezbollah grew and grew in strength. So I think the lesson is that occupying others' land does not necessarily produce stability or peace. And most analysts would say that Hezbollah has grown in strength over recent years. So that's what makes this current situation so dangerous and uncertain. It's not clear, what the cost to either side would be of a massive escalation. And I think that's one of the big messages that the diplomats are trying to convey to all of them through the private channels and increasingly publicly.
What, Julie, would an escalation look like? I mean, we've seen an increase in missile strikes by both parties over this weekend. But what could something more serious and long-term look like? Is there the prospect that Israel could send its tanks into Lebanon?
Well, I think that is certainly what many are fearful of now, is a full-on ground invasion, which, as Mark has alluded to, would not be unprecedented, but has usually not worked out well for either party. And we've gotten to these very long wars of attrition when that's happened in the past. Otherwise, short of that, and I think the buildup to that would be more intensified airstrikes. Again, we saw the one strike on Beirut last week by Israel. I think that had its own strategic element behind it, but I think it was also showing that Israel can and will carry out more of these deeper strikes into Beirut and deeper into Lebanon if necessary. And again, Hezbollah's strikes also over the weekend showing that they can and will strike deeper. We should remember that the tit-for-tat strikes for the last 11 months have happened mostly within a sort of 15-mile radius of the border, and that's kind of a set range there for quite a while that now we see that expanding behind. So I think we can expect the escalation in airstrikes, the prospect of a possible ground invasion, though I think everyone is trying to avoid that. And then, of course, things that we just can't foresee, like those pager and walkie-talkie attacks that are, different types of warfare that might be pulled out in this conflict.
Mark, let's turn our attention to the UN General Assembly. In the headlines, I mentioned that Volodymyr Zelensky has arrived and is wanting to try to sort of come up with what he describes as a sort of like the once and for all peace plan. We also have the anniversary of the Israel-Hamas conflict beginning. This is enough, if not. At what point does the UN recognise that it's got too much on its plate?
Well, what the Secretary General hoped that this year's high-level meeting of all the world leaders in New York at the General Assembly would be about is a summit of the future, getting to grips with issues like climate change and the global economy and all the issues that really are the domestic concerns of most member states. But as you say, in fact, the agenda is going to be dominated by various issues around global peace and security. Obviously, the Middle East will be very high on the list. There's also Ukraine. There's also the appalling war in Sudan, probably the worst conflict going on in the world at the moment. And, the way geopolitics has evolved, the great powers are finding it harder to collaborate, and space has opened up over the last decade or so for belligerents in various locations to pursue their agendas. And it's becoming harder and harder to dissuade would-be combatants in various parts of the world against, violent pursuit of their agenda. And that's why we've got this kind of large-scale, multiple conflicts all at the same time, which makes it harder to deal effectively with any one of them.
Mark, staying with you, where is the scope for the UN to expand to accommodate this problem? And I mean, you've worked in the humanitarian side of things. How can it make sure that where needed, help is offered?
The deal with the UN now is the same as it's always been since its founders created it in 1945, 1946, which is the institutions of the UN themselves are given very little power. The power is held by the member states. In the Security Council, when there's a consensus, the UN can take strong measures. It can impose peacekeeping operations. It can enforce sanctions and so on. The General Assembly doesn't have those kinds of powers. The humanitarian work of the UN, which reaches more than 100 million people a year and certainly saves millions of lives a year, is voluntarily funded by the member states. So every time there's a problem, the UN agencies, UNICEF, the Refugee Agency, the World Food Programme, and the NGOs have to go cap in hand to people to get money to help the victims and those suffering. So, the UN, we used to joke when I was sitting on the 38th floor with the Secretary General that we're all Secretary and no General. We have the power of cajoling and encouraging and begging and pleading. But as Stalin liked to say, the UN has no battalions. So what we have is a force of moral authority. But what member states do, depends on more than the exhortations that come from the UN headquarters.
So, Julie, finally, the fact that this is taking place in New York, we are, in the middle of an electoral campaign for the White House. But the United States, how much does it still have the authority about which Mark had just spoken, or are they too reduced to what he described, cajoling, begging and pleading for something to happen to calm this down?
Well, it certainly seems that way. And there's a couple of ways to look at that. I mean, one, I think many are aware that the U.S. sometimes takes the move of weakening some of the UN resolutions by vetoing them in the Security Council. So in terms of the UN role, the U.S. does have a role there that it plays. But in terms of the Middle East more broadly, I mean, I would say for the last 11 months, we've seen the Biden administration trying to do all this diplomatic work, I think being more restrained on military aid leverage, where many would have, liked to have seen them use more kind of pressure there. But at this point, they really are almost just throwing their hands up. I mean, obviously, they are still working towards a ceasefire, trying to work on the diplomatic side in Lebanon. But I think it's become finally clear to them that they are just not getting the results that they thought that they could and probably won't before the election. I think that reality is starting to sink in.
Julie Norman and Sir Mark Lowcock, thank you both for joining me on The Globalist. You're listening to Monocle Radio. Now, a neo-Marxist outsider has won this weekend's elections in Sri Lanka. Just 2 years ago, a deep economic crisis led to the toppling of the country's authoritarian president. But now Anura Kumara Dissanayake has promised a fresh start. Well, I'm joined now by Ganeshan Wignaraja, who's a visiting senior fellow at ODI, a leading UK think tank on global affairs, currently in Colombo. A very good afternoon to you, Ganeshan.
Hi, Emma. It's lovely to be back on your show again.
Delighted to have you. Right, just explain to us, who is Anura Kumara Dissanayake, an outsider in an election that many thought would have no outright winner this weekend?
Yes, so he is 55 years old and a long-time MP of a left-leaning coalition called National People's Power. And he was a former agriculture minister and also holds a BSc in science degree from a Sri Lankan university. He led a very interesting campaign on anti-corruption and pro-poor policies, which is the focus of his manifesto, A Thriving Nation, A Beautiful Life. And what he hopes to achieve is a more progressive, compassionate, and corruption based economy, which is very important. And his campaign, surprised some in Colombo because the incumbent president, Ranil Wickremesinghe, was thought to be the hero of achieving an economic turnaround for Sri Lanka from the terrible economic crisis we had. But Anura Kumara prevailed because of a very clever campaign and the fact that President Wickremesinghe had not paid insufficient attention to the high poverty rates in Sri Lanka that austerity policies have caused.
Because Sri Lanka, let's go back to 2022. There was a terrible economic crisis. The Sri Lankans defaulted on their debt and it led to poverty, unemployment, widespread dissatisfaction. And then the president was ousted, replaced by Ranil Wickremesinghe, who to all intents and purposes was able to re-stabilise the country. Was this more of a reaction against him and his legacy, or was this a desire by the Sri Lankans to embrace a completely different future?
So Ranil Wickremesinghe, deserves credit for having taken over the country at a time of great difficulty. There were these very long queues for essentials and fuel. The economy was contracting. Poverty had, doubled to 25% of the population. And Wickremesinghe implemented decisive stabilization measures, such as getting the central bank to hike interest rates to control galloping inflation. He got an IMF program, got Indian aid. And the economy has turned around because of these measures. But you remember James Carville, Bill Clinton's political advisor, famously said, when it comes to elections, it's the economy stupid. So we expected in some quarters Sri Lanka to have Wickremesinghe, winning the election. But this year was an exception, and he paid the price for austerity measures, which were necessary. I think suffering was one. Because of poverty, but also there was a perception of rent-seeking and corruption by some politicians. He paid a price, but I think hopefully history will be kind to Wickremesinghe for having brought the country out of this into a relatively normal state to some extent. But the debt crisis remains a problem for us.
So what direction will Anura Kumara Dissanayake take the country? Reports suggest that his party has the Soviet hammer and sickle as its logo, and there are gifts from Lenin, Mao Zedong and Ho Chi Minh or mementos in the headquarters in Colombo. This is a very different path that Sri Lanka could be taking.
To be honest, there has been a change in that particular party, which used to be called the JVP, and they have moderated their stance on many issues. And they would probably be categorized in today's context as a kind of a soft left group. I mean, they're talking about pro-poor welfare policies, good governance, tough anti-corruption. They're talking about a production-oriented economy, which is very pro-small business and diaspora investment by cutting red tape. But there remains a role for the state, which will be quite important alongside the private sector. So it's a slightly different take to what some people make it. He has worked very hard to reform the party, I think. And I think we will see some of that to come. Some of the symbols exist from the past of the JVP, which is a co-party in this coalition. But I think we must give them a chance because, democratically, he's come through the system where majority of Sri Lankans did elect him. So I think he deserves a chance, and we will have to let, economics and history judge his achievement.
Finally, briefly, if you won't mind, Ganeshan, the reaction from the international community has been pretty brutal. We've got Sri Lankan government bonds tumbling this morning, with investors worried that this new president will renegotiate the IMF bailout. What is the likelihood of that happening, and how dangerous would that be for Sri Lanka?
So just on the international front, Prime Minister Modi of India has congratulated him, and I think the United States have also issued a statement. But it is true that the bond markets and private investors are worried because of legacy issues connected with this particular party. On the IMF program, Anil Kumar Dissanayake is talking about keeping the broad parameters, but renegotiating some of the austerity measures. I mean, this is a difficult issue because once you have an IMF program, you take their parameters as given. And if Sri Lanka were to find this program stalled or the IMF to walk away, it would put Sri Lanka in some difficulty in regards external financing. But the debt is still high, and we need the IMF and other donors to provide financing for imports of essential goods, fuel, food, etc. So I suspect they will try, but they will sort of find the reality and probably come within the program, one hopes, and then go for a growth-oriented program which has some measures on welfare as well as part of it. So one is somewhat optimistic for now.
Ganeshan Wignaraja in Colombo, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. Still to come in the programme, we're off to Milan for Fashion Week, and the papers follow in just a second. Stay with us on The Globalist.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
7:23 here in London. A look now at Monday's newspapers. I'm delighted to say that bringing all the work with him is Robin Brandt, BBC's former China correspondent, a regular voice around the Monocle table. A very good morning to you, Robin. How is the world of the Brandts today?
Good, yeah. I mean, energetic is not how it feels, but there was quite a lot of work, and there's some good stuff around to crack into.
I am delighted to hear it. Now, the first story that you want to bring us sort of made me, I don't know, just made me think, goodness me, my heart sank, but at the same time, it's happening. Voting has already started in America.
It has, in 3 of the 50 states. 43 days to go until November the 5th. But already in Minnesota, South Dakota and Virginia, and these are not swing states as things stand at the minute, voting has started. People are turning up, casting their ballots. And this is a phenomenon that was hugely significant in the 2020 election, in that post-COVID era, and may continue to be hugely important as well, particularly for the Democrats, who seem to be the ones who benefit from early voting or benefit from the mail-in ballots. But yeah, voting has started in 3 states with 43 days to go. And what fascinates me most about this phenomenon aside from how it plays out, the dynamics for the particular parties, and of course that narrative that, as Donald Trump supporters may say if they're listening to this, the steal has started, although of course there was never any evidence for that. But it's voting so early, with so long still to go in a campaign that we know is so tight, but some people will have their say now.
Indeed, and the FT is mentioned, and we mentioned it in the headlines as well, that Donald Trump has used this, or has quoted this early voting as the reason why he will not engage in another televised debate with Kamala Harris.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all know why he's not going to engage in another televised debate, and it's got very little to do with mail-in ballots and the fraud that Trump supporters believe is inherent within the system. Of course, a fraud that I have to say yet again there is no evidence of. But 43 days to go in a campaign that's so tight, particularly in those swing states, Michigan, Pennsylvania and Georgia. And that is where this election is going to be won and lost. But there are people, particularly on the Democratic side, those who are on the older side, more senior voters, who are having their say already. And it's hugely early. And for me, the idea of declaring your intentions now, I find fascinating.
Indeed. And also, just looking at the pictures that are associated with this article in the Financial Times, the posters for Trump, Vance, Harris, Walz are both blue with white typeface on them. And one wonders, the closeness of the electoral campaign may be down to the fact that the posters don't look a million miles too different.
If you base your kind of decision on, whether you like the badges, whether you like the car bumper stickers — I haven't seen any good car bumper stickers actually this time around — then yeah, I think you're in trouble. But look, we know when we hear J.D. Vance speak, when we hear President Trump speak, former President Trump, there is a huge divide, isn't there? There is a huge difference on some of those core policies between these two parties. So if you're paying attention, maybe you are watching the debates, I think it's easier to make a decision about the kind of values you have and the kind of things you want to see done. If it's down to what the posters look like, I think you're probably in trouble.
Massive trouble. Let's have a look at a story from the Rio Times that you wanted to bring us in about a major water shortage in Ecuador.
Yeah, no, I think Ecuador and the fate that has befallen that country over the last decade is tragically fascinating. This was a part of the world that 10 years ago had a growing economy in terms of tourism, and its future seems so different to the way things have turned out in the last 10 years. And the reason that things have gone so bad in Ecuador is because of its geographical positioning, and it's about the drug economy as well, and the dominance of the cartels in that part of the world, and a war essentially going on between rival cartels in Ecuador that has seen huge violence take over that country. And now we have another disaster, but this one is down to climate change. We've had 71 days in Ecuador when there's been no rain, a terrible, terrible drought, the worst in, I think, 2 or maybe even 3 generations. And the government is having to fall back on very extreme measures. And part of that was nationwide power cuts over the weekend. In 12 provinces, there was no power at all during the day. This is the second wave of these kind of nationwide power cuts. And the reason they're doing them is because most of the power in Ecuador is generated by hydroelectric dams and reservoirs. There isn't enough water. They want to preserve the water in those reservoirs, and so they need to cut the amount of power they're generating. But yet another kind of tragedy to befall a country that 10 years ago you would never be having this kind of conversation about it and its future. Let's
move north to North America, to the United States. The LA Times, a piece on the crisis in Californian film production. An industry that was hit by COVID, and then we all remember last year's strikes. There's a hard road to recovery here.
Yeah, but it's going very slowly. All the studios, or certainly in the Western world, in terms of the movie production that dominates for much of us, remain in Los Angeles, remain in California. Obviously, for 100 plus years they've been here. But this phenomenon of runaway productions, where the movies and the TV are made elsewhere, both in the US but also globally, is really hitting this industry. And look, this is a piece in the LA Times that's packed full of statistics, some of them quite mind-blowing. Netflix has pumped almost $1 billion into a brand new studio in New Mexico, in Albuquerque. Much of this is about statewide policy, it's about tax incentives. But apparently in the last 4 years, the number of shoot days in Los Angeles has fallen by a third. And that is obviously really affecting an industry that has its home, certainly in terms of Western cinema and American cinema in that part of the world. But yeah, we had COVID, we had the SAG-AFTRA strikes, and this industry isn't really recovering. And what many within the Times piece are saying within the industry is, guess what the answer is? That's right, tax incentives. The California taxpayer is going to have to be the one to try and bring much of this industry back. They want to see the incentives go up. But look, they're competing, with other parts of the US. They're also competing with us here in the UK. Part of the reason for this decline in the film industry staying in California is down to the success of countries like ours here, the UK. Pinewood and Shepperton and movies like Barbie and other policies from governments in the past have made it places like this far more competitive.
It does show as if the whole of the film industry is being sort of shattered by a sort of lack of competition, but then this extreme competitiveness that countries are able to offer filmmakers nowadays. And it's really beautifully put together in this article by the LA Times by saying, a filmmaker is saying, I'm not competing with Universal or Warner or a huge, beautiful facility. I'm competing against Canada. I'm competing against New York. I'm competing against Mexico. And people are sort of being given scripts and said, it's not like go out and find where we can shoot this. People are actually being directed away from Los Angeles to do the filming.
Yeah, so shock horror. It turns out a business like this is all about business. It's about tax incentives, about keeping the costs down. It's about finding where those margins are. But look, I think in the last 10 years in particular, we've seen a shift. And much of this is driven by lower costs as well. Obviously, you need an increase in creative industries and your ability to make these movies, but a shift towards Central Europe as well. Many movies being made in studios, sound stages in Hungary, in the Czech Republic. And like I say, still, the capability that countries like the UK has remains hugely competitive when it comes to dragging business away from its traditional base in the US there in California.
Finally, an article from the Straits Times. If you like your coffee hot and cheap, you're in trouble.
Give me hot and cheap coffee. Yeah. Well, and what I like about this is that apparently much of the coffee, I've got one in my hand now from your lovely kitchen. Thanks very much. Much of the coffee we drink, particularly the higher end, is the Arabica bean. This is about a competing bean called the Robusta.
It's a rough and tumble brother, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, yeah. But apparently it's increasingly popular. It's more durable. It's almost matching Arabica on the price. It tends to go into instant drinks, kind of espressos, that kind of thing. A lot of it's grown in Vietnam. There's been a big drought there, followed by lots of rain. Also, some of the farmers there are shifting to something else that others of you might be having for breakfast this morning. They're shifting to alternative crops like avocados. They don't really want to be growing coffee. But a combination of the economics, some of the weather, means that there's going to be fewer Robusta beans around when it comes to harvest next month. The price has almost doubled in the last year. And so the prospect of even your kind of more instant espresso coffee drinks being more competitive on price, well, it looks like that's gone for the next year.
Robin Brandt, we are horrified. Thank you so much for joining us in the studio. The time here in London is just nudging 7:33 a.m. You're listening to The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson, and a quick summary now of what else we're keeping an eye on today. At least 4 people have been killed and 18 injured in a mass shooting in Birmingham, Alabama. Officers found the bodies of 2 men and 1 woman at the scene, where a 3rd man later died of bullet wounds in hospital. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has urged his partners to help achieve a shared victory for a truly just peace. As he arrived in the United States to attend sessions at the UN General Assembly, he warned that this autumn will determine the future of this war. Iran's elite revolutionary guards have ordered its members to stop using any type of communication devices after thousands of pagers and walkie-talkies used by its Hezbollah allies in Lebanon blew up in deadly attacks last week. One of the security officials said a large-scale operation is now underway to inspect all of its devices. And Donald Trump has said that he won't run for the US presidency again if he loses this year's election. The 78-year-old former president says he thinks that will be it. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Now, Narendra Modi has chosen the timing of his visit to the United States rather well. In addition to the bilateral meeting with President Joe Biden, attending the Quad Countries Summit of India, Japan, the US and Australia, Prime Minister Modi is also in town for the United Nations General Assembly. Well, to find out what's on his to-do list and his done list, let's hear now from Maya Sharma, a journalist based in Bangalore. Very good morning to you, Maya.
Good morning, Emma.
This has been a very busy weekend of opportunity for Narendra Modi.
Oh, it's certainly been a very, very packed visit. 3 days of Narendra Modi in the United States, and he's really been on the go from the moment he touched down. Yes, he had that meeting with Biden, a bilateral meeting with Biden, at Biden's residence in Delaware, at his home in Delaware. And Prime Minister Modi said this is really an indication of warmth, an indication of closeness between the two countries. And of course, as you mentioned, that Quad summit, that very important summit between the four countries making up Quad, India, the United States, Japan, and Australia. And this meeting, of course, did discuss, not quite directly, but did talk about China's activities in the South China Sea, the East and South China Seas, without mentioning China, saying there was concern about Chinese activities, about aggressive activities in that region. So India, of course, playing a greater and greater role in the world, especially with countries like America, who are hoping that China's influence does not remain too dominant, and that China can, in fact, be curbed by India's presence.
This is the sort of goes to the nub of it, doesn't it? That the Indian and in principle, Narendra Modi's transactional approach is what has both reassured but unsettled the global order, hasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. In many ways, whether it's his hugging Putin recently and then following it up with a hug with Zelensky. He also has refused to actually join some of the sanctions. India has not joined some of the sanctions by the United Nations against Israel, but he did meet the Palestinian president while in the United States. He's trying to balance different groups. And while this is, of course, as you said, transactional, it's kind of playing both sides. It is something which India has been doing for many decades. It has, of course, been very much a part of the earlier non-aligned movement. It does say it is close to Russia. Quad did not really mention Russia directly, although they did express some support to Ukraine. They did not mention Russia directly, possibly because India is so close to Russia. But yes, he does walk a fine balancing line on many issues indeed.
We also have this push by Narendra Modi while he is there to really sell India on the global tech stage. I mean, he's had a meeting with the Google and Alphabet CEO. He's also spoken to the CEO of NVIDIA, all of whom are saying that India is home to some of the world's greatest computer scientists. It has the infrastructure, and it is now going to be really a big player when it comes to things like AI.
Absolutely. He did meet tech leaders and spoke of India as the land of opportunities, not a land that was looking for opportunities, but one which would actually provide opportunities to others. And he said that he spoke to the business leaders saying that India would be very happy to collaborate when it came to AI, semiconductors, biotech. And he's basically talking to these CEOs about the need for upskilling. AI, of course, a huge factor, but definitely looking at India as projecting India as a place of the future, as a place which could actually progress when it comes to technology. Of course, possibly it does help that so many CEOs in America of the big tech companies are of Indian origin. I'm sure that doesn't hurt. But yes, he's certainly making a push for India as a place to be.
And finally, his presence at the UN General Assembly, what will that bring?
Well, of course, the United Nations is in session, and we're talking about the summit of the future. He will, of course, be talking again. He'll be pushing India's agenda as perhaps a kind of peacemaker, as a progressive country. India, of course, the market is so huge. It's the fifth largest economy in the world now. It cannot be ignored on the global scale. And while the United Nations, as I said, they've not always backed some of the United Nations backed sanctions against Israel, India is, of course, wanting to be a player there. He's also hoping perhaps to be on the Security Council. If there are changes made in the Security Council, India would like to be part of this. And many other countries, apart from India, feel that it should be. But of course, it requires the approval of the 5 permanent members who are not really on great talking terms at this moment. But India could be possibly hoping for that. And on the sidelines of the meeting, of course, many bilateral meetings with leaders who are also in the United States for this United Nations summit.
Maya Sharma in Bangalore, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. You are the Globalist. 8:39 in Berlin, 7:39 here in London. Now, Germany's Social Democrats appear to have enjoyed a narrow victory in elections in the eastern state of Brandenburg. The win creates a brief amount of breathing space for Chancellor Olaf Scholz as he prepares to run for a second term next year. Well, for more on this, let's hear from Andrew Bulkley, who's co-founder of 20% Berlin. A very good morning to you, Andrew.
Hey, good morning.
So the projections by the public broadcasters suggest that the Social Democrats are on a tiny majority over the Alternative für Deutschland. Could you just clarify what's happening, please?
Sure, the SPD, the center-left SPD, appear to have won the election 1.5 percentage points ahead of the AfD, of course, the far-right AfD. It had been a neck-and-neck race the whole time. Polls would say the AfD is ahead. Polls would say the SPD is ahead. So it's a breath of relief that the SPD did actually win. We had two other state elections earlier this month, one in Thuringia, which went to the AfD, and another one in Saxony, which went to the conservative CDU. And in both of those, there was a race between the CDU and the AfD, two right-wing parties. Of course, the conservatives are not nearly as far right as the AfD. But so this is a bit of an outlier that the SPD, a center-left party and a major party in Germany, won. They had no noticeable results in the other two elections. So it's a bit of relief for Chancellor Scholz. Had the AfD won by 2, 3, 4 percentage points, a surprise win, that would have been the end of Chancellor Scholz. But so now he gets a bit of breathing room. So hopefully there's some rumbling that the federal government may not survive till the election next September. But this at least gives him a chance to maybe make that work.
I mean, how much has Olaf Scholz dodged humiliation here? I mean, you mentioned there that had the socialists lost Brandenburg, then that would have been the end of it for him. Is that right?
There most certainly would have been a vote of confidence placed in the parliament, and there's actually a lot of rumbling going on that maybe the SPD, Scholz's party, would be better to govern right now federally with the conservative CDU. At the moment, they're governing with the environmental Greens and the pro-business FDP, and they're not really getting along. Of course, the Greens and the FDP have very differing ideological stances, and Scholz is just not a very strong leader. He's not very popular, and so that would have been the end if he couldn't have contained the AfD's rise in the former East Germany. But really, how the SPD won this time is they have a very strong leader in Brandenburg, Voigtke, and really Voigtke avoided Scholz. Scholz played no role in Brandenburg, and that's probably what saved it.
There is also the fact that the AfD, which has, as you say, has enjoyed successes in Saxony and Thuringen in the last couple of weeks, was not a success in Brandenburg, and the vote by all accounts enjoyed a very high turnout, but 70%, 7 out of 10 voters in the state, did not want the Alternative für Deutschland. How much is there a pushback now against the far right, which just seems so utterly unpalatable from the outside?
I don't think we can actually talk about a pushback. There is certainly a swing to the left a little bit, but it has to be known that the AfD did get 5.7 percentage points more in this election than they did previously. You brought up the 75% voter turnout, which is a record turnout for this election. And there does appear to have been some strategic voting where people left other parties and voted for the SPD to ensure that the AfD did not become the strongest party. The AfD strength is really bewildering, and it also has to be said there's another party, a brand new party, that this is their first election in Brandenburg, the Association for Sarah Wagenknecht. We really just call it the Sarah Wagenknecht Party. It's really a collection of former left-wing voters from East Germany. They're voting for a leader of the former Die Linke, the far-left party. She left and formed his own party with their own name, and they got 13.5 percentage points. So that's also notable in this election. And what's very, very noticeable in this election is completely polarized. You have two strong parties on the right, the AfD, of course, far right. Then you have the conservative CDU with 12.1 percentage points. And then on the left, you have the SPD with 30.9% and the Sarah Wagenknecht party with 13.5%. And that's it. There are no other parties, which is unusual in Germany. Usually there's smaller parties, the Greens, the FDP. This is purely these four parties, which represent really two viewpoints. So it's very polarized at the moment.
So how does this polarized situation set us up for next year's federal elections?
I think what I think will happen in the election is that the SPD and the CDU will be strong enough to form what they call here in Germany the Grand Coalition. The two big, strong parties, the traditional parties, will be able to govern probably the conservative CDU will be the strongest and will be able to pick the chancellor, Friedrich Merz, who's unpopular everywhere except in his own party. And certainly the AfD will play a role. But we have to remember these elections are the former East where the AfD is the strongest. So the AfD will probably get half of what it's gotten. Now, it won't get the 30% that it gets in the former East. It will get 10 to 15%.
Andrew Buckley in Berlin, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
7:45 here in London. It's time now to talk business with Isabel Hamilton, who's a senior reporter at the Daily Upside. A very good morning to you, Isabel.
Good morning.
Let's talk about Wizz Air and budget airlines. They've hit the headlines in the last few weeks for offering this almost like an all-you-can-eat airline buffet. But that's not stemmed the big financial woes that it's facing.
Well, yes. What's happening with Wizz Air is that short sellers are kind of piling into that stock. Short sellers are basically people who bet against a company doing well. And it looks like Wizz Air, out of the big European budget airlines, is the one that's attracting the most attention from them. There's a few reasons for that. They've got a lot of debt. They've been particularly exposed to a problem with Airbus engines. So they've got a lot of planes that they can't fly at the moment. They need to lease new ones. And also they're based out of Hungary. And this is apparently a reason why short sellers think they might be a bit more vulnerable than, say, EasyJet or Ryanair, because they're very near to Ukraine.
And also there's the issue as well that, and this surprised me given the fact that all the intelligence and the numbers that are coming out of the aviation world suggest that demand for travel is hotter and higher than ever. But when it comes to certain parts of the airline sector, this is actually not the case.
Absolutely. So this summer, budget airlines really realised that consumers had sort of hit their limit on travel. You know, we had a big sort of pent up demand after lockdown that lasted quite a long time. And then it really started to drop off in summer this year. So Ryanair started lowering prices. Other places started lowering prices. And Ryanair is predicting that actually airfares will continue to fall. So in the budget airline industry, definitely there's a bit of a softening of demand.
Nonetheless, the likes of Wizz Air are pushing their ambitions higher. I mean, it's only a few weeks ago saying that Wizz Air is actually going to start offering a no-frills service to Jeddah in Saudi Arabia and to Abu Dhabi next year. I mean, no promise of any comfy cushions or eye masks, but there is that feeling that they want to push their boundaries further. So how have they managed to make that happen?
Well, they're going to be charging a lot less for it. So the idea is that they'll try and, get some consumers away from bigger, more luxurious airlines. But yeah, the kind of no frills aspect of it actually goes quite far. They're not going to be offering food to you on this flight, unless they sell it to you for a profit. So yeah, it's really they're cutting back on all the costs on that particular flight.
And it sort of then opens up the big question as to how much pricing becomes a determining factor in something like this, doesn't it?
Definitely. And you kind of ask yourself how many people who are flying to Saudi Arabia will want to get on a 7+ hour flight with absolutely no amenities.
Pack your sandwiches. Right, let's move to the Biden administration and its continued problem with China and its software.
Yes. So this was a report that the Biden administration is going to ban car software that is made in China. And the reason it's given is cybersecurity concerns. It's worried particularly about things like automated driving software and communication software. And it's saying that it doesn't want China to be able to potentially hack into an American citizen's car and potentially get any data about them. And this is kind of part of a wider picture because the Biden administration has placed really high tariffs on particularly Chinese electric vehicles. So they're pretty much absent from the market in the US. And software is a really big part of how we build a car now. And, this is something that potentially Chinese companies could sell sort of piecemeal to other companies. And the Biden administration wants to close that loophole.
What is the risk with Chinese software?
Well, what the administration says is that, this software could be used, I guess, to spy on people. If you're making calls from your car, much like your phone, then, that's tappable. But yeah, you should really sort of think about this story in the broader context of there being something of a trade war between the two countries. And China, in the past, has expressed a similar concern, specifically about Teslas, because that's a big American brand that's, present in China. And they said in the past that they're worried that Tesla's software could be used to spy on Chinese citizens.
Let's move on to a story about nuclear power, and the world's biggest banks are backing it.
Yeah, this is a group of 14 banks and financial institutions that are going to join this pledge today to support nuclear power development. They are saying that this is sort of tied into a goal that was set at COP28. The idea is to triple nuclear capacity by 2050. And the problem for banks in terms of financing nuclear power is, well, it's the same for anyone who wants to finance nuclear power. It's a very high risk investment. Nuclear power stations tend to go over budget. They tend to take a lot longer to build than they initially say they will. So really, getting that kind of investor confidence from big financial institutions will make a difference to the industry.
Do we know what role the banks are going to play in all of this? Because the article in the Financial Times, which talks about this, says nuclear experts say that the public show of support is a longer-rated recognition that the sector has a critical role when it comes to transitioning to low-carbon energy. But it does need the backing of not just governments, but the private sector, doesn't it?
Yes, they haven't set out any concrete sort of goals yet, but the idea is that they're going to be more confident in piling into sort of financing. We are also seeing in other areas of the private sector, that there is a little bit more demand for nuclear power. And this is partly because big tech companies are going around at the moment looking for energy to power the AI systems they want to build. And Microsoft in particular is really keen on nuclear power. They've actually struck a deal with an energy company to reopen a reactor on 3 Mile Island in the US, which has a pretty checkered PR history.
Indeed. I mean, what would be the implications of that, the private sector in nuclear?
Well, that nuclear might get a bit of a boost from these very large sectors who are very keen to build up energy supply.
Isabel Hamilton, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Globalist. Let's hear now about Milan Fashion Week. Natalie Teodosi is our fashion director. She's been in Milan since the end of last week, and she joins me now for a big summary of what's been going on. A very good morning to you, Natalie.
Good morning.
So let's begin with the big headline that seems to have come out of Milan, not about fashion and what we saw at the shows, but what Miuccia Prada was saying backstage.
Yes, I think it's always so interesting to go backstage and listen to what Miuccia Prada has to say. There's always nuggets of wisdom, and that's why you get this scrum with journalists, with their recorders crowding around her. But I made my way through, and it was worth it. She was speaking about a very current topic, algorithms, and how we're constantly being bombarded with information, how this influences our taste. And she just wanted a clean slate. She wanted something that felt a lot more human. So naturally, she started looking at her own past, at things that have made Prada what it is today. And what she ended up with was 40-something looks. And instead of having one cohesive idea, each look was its own concept, which made her very nervous, she said. But it all kind of came together. And in typical Prada way, she always loves to add a bit of humor. She said that the common thread was this idea of superheroes. So you would also find some really funky sunglasses, futuristic headwear on all the models.
And it's a wonderful thing because what she's pushing back against is the fact that everybody else seems to be influenced so much by everybody else that actually the ability to have an original thought and an original idea is really challenged.
Exactly. I think we see it on the catwalk brands' collections start to blend and everything looks very homogeneous. So this idea of every single look being one idea, every single model looking different, was really refreshing and really fun to watch. Also, she brought back a lot of icons from over the years, whether it was Prada brogues, the pencil skirts, different sorts of embellishments from past years. So those who know the brand and love the brand were feeling really excited to rediscover those beloved pieces.
I bet they were. Now, we're also looking very, very closely at Tod's, which doesn't always have the sharpest reputation, but it's under a new creative director, Matteo Tamburini. And how was his show?
It was such a great show, one of the highlights of Milan Fashion Week. And like you say, Tod's is usually best known for its footwear, especially the famous loafers. The clothing especially and the catwalk shows don't get as much of a warm reception from the fashion crowds here in Milan. But this really changed since Matteo Tamburini joined last year from Bottega Veneta. It was a really beautiful show, really ethereal, a lot of Grecian-inspired influences, and I think a lot of accessories that will put the brand on a really fast growth trajectory. Both the shoes, but he had some great bucket bags as well that will sell really well.
How does that change the mood in Milan when you get perhaps a brand that needs to be dusted down coming out and really making a lovely splash?
You know, you can see it on people's faces. We have the reputation of looking a little bit grumpy in fashion, but as soon as you see a collection like that, you see everyone smiling, you see the mood being uplifted, and it's always good to see a brand doing well and winning.
Let's have a look at Loro Piana as well. They're celebrating their 100-year anniversary. What was their showing off like?
So that was a much more intimate presentation, but still very beautiful, and it's interesting. I had a chat with the CEO, Damien Bertrand, who joined from Dior Couture the last 3 years, and you can really see his vision come together. Of course, they're doing the amazing cashmere and really beautiful ready-to-wear, but he's trying to push the brand to offer a full look. So you saw a new sunglass collection for the first time, really great handbags, and also jewelry, which is new territory for them, but they're doing it at that high level that they're always known for. And I think we'll just see Loro Piana growing and growing in the next few years under LVMH and Bertrand.
And finally, Bottega Veneta. It's now become the go-to show, hasn't it?
It is such a highlight, and it closes the week on such a high. I love what Mathieu Blasi has been doing, and what is most interesting, I think, is that he doesn't try to use the usual tricks of the fashion industry, always changing, always following seasonal trends. He established this concept of craft in motion from the very beginning, and he just keeps exploring it, and you see him pushing boundaries in terms of craft, in terms of the materials that he presents every season, but also exploring this idea of motion that we're all relating to. You could feel that the models were people that were on their way to work, on their way to the gym, on their way to catch a flight. And then I think that's something that everyone can relate to. And even if you can't, buy a full Bottega Veneta look, you can get really smart styling ideas.
Natalie Theodosi, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. That was our fashion director, Natalie Theodosi, there on the line from Milan. And that's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to the producers, Hassan Anderson and Carlotta Rebella. Our research was Sana Jumani, and our studio manager was Mariella Bevan. And the warmest of thanks to my guests too. After the headlines, more music on the way. The briefing is live at midday in London. I'll be bringing you all the big stories in a little while. The Globalist is back at the same time tomorrow. I hope you can join me for that if you can as well. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening, and have a great week.